I screamed, "Stop that bulldozer right now!" But the driver didn't even flinch. The engine roared louder, drowning out my voice as the metal blade crashed through the side of my father's old barn. The ground shook beneath my boots. Dust exploded into the air, thick enough to sting my throat and blur my vision. The smell of diesel and splintered cedar filled my lungs. And then, silence. Just the steady clatter of wood collapsing onto itself. My heart sank. That barn wasn't just a building. It was my history. My father's handprints were on every beam. I ran toward the site, waving my arms, choking on tears and dust. "Who told you to do this?" I shouted. The man in the hard hat turned away, motioning towards someone standing behind him. That's when I saw him. Greg Simmons, the HOA president, standing by his shiny black SUV, arms crossed like he owned the whole neighborhood. His tie was too tight for a Texas morning, his smirk too calm for what he'd just done. "Greg!" I yelled. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" He lifted a sheet of paper, smug and deliberate. "Violation notice," he said. "This structure doesn't comply with community standards." I grabbed the paper out of his hand. It was a generic form. No signatures, no permit number, no county seal. "You can't just," he interrupted, voice dripping with arrogance. "You were warned, Sarah. This place is supposed to look uniform. We can't have old rotting barns bringing down property values." I looked past him at the wreckage. The barn door lying sideways in the dirt, the weathered Whitfield Ranch sign half buried under splinters. My throat tightened. That barn was my father's last project before he died. He built it with his own hands after coming back from deployment. Every nail, every crack in the wood told a story. And now it was gone, erased with a shrug and a smirk. Neighbors stood at a distance, watching from their driveways. No one said a word. I saw curtains twitch, phones recording from behind blinds. Nobody dared speak against Greg. He was the kind of man who fined people for having mismatched mailbox colors. He ruled this neighborhood like a small-town dictator, using the HOA rules like weapons. I dropped to my knees beside a pile of broken boards, brushing my hand over a piece of red-painted wood. I could almost hear my father's laugh echoing through the barn again. "You take care of this place, Sarah," he told me once. "It's your roots." My hand shook as I stood. "You had no right," I said quietly. Greg was already walking away. "I'll see you at the next HOA meeting," he tossed over his shoulder. "If you're still a member by then." I stood there long after the bulldozer left, staring at what used to be the heart of my home. The air was heavy, thick with smoke and betrayal. But beneath the grief something else was rising, a slow burning fury. HOAs can't demolish private property without a court order or proper notice. I knew that. Greg knew that. He just thought I wouldn't fight back. He thought I'd cry, clean up the mess, and move on. But as the dust settled and the last echo of the bulldozer faded into the distance, I whispered to myself, voice trembling but certain, they just declared war on the wrong woman. The barn wasn't just wood. It was my childhood, my father's sweat, and my home's soul. The morning after the demolition, I walked across what used to be our family's pride. The smell of ash and oil still lingered in the air. Splintered beams stuck out of the dirt like broken bones. The old weather vane lay half buried, twisted and rusted, its arrow still pointing north, the direction my father always said home would be. I bent down and picked up a piece of charred wood, still painted red in spots. My father had built that barn with nothing but his hands, a hammer and grit. I could still see him in my mind, his sunburned arms swinging nails into fresh pine, sweat dripping into the dust, whistling old country songs while I handed him tools I could barely lift. He used to say, "This barn will outlast me, Sarah. It'll outlast anything." But it hadn't outlasted Greg Simmons. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I was 10 years old again, riding in circles as my father shouted, "Loosen up your grip. Let the horse feel your hands." The air had smelled like hay in summer. Now, all I could smell was diesel. The ground that once echoed with laughter was silent except for the faint creak of a broken door swinging in the wind. I noticed a few neighbors walking by, pretending not to look. Mrs. Turner from down the street whispered something to her husband and quickly turned away. Later, I'd learn what she was whispering about. Greg had been talking for months about phasing out rural eyesores to make the community more modern. Apparently, my barn had been first on his list. That's when the anger took over the sadness. I went inside, grabbed my laptop, and started making calls. First to the county office. I explained what happened, my voice shaking but steady. The woman on the other end put me on hold, then came back with a tone of disbelief. "Ma'am," she said, "there's no demolition permit under your address, or under your HOA's name. Nothing was filed." The words hit harder than I expected. So it was illegal. All of it. Greg hadn't just bullied me. He'd broken the law. I filed an official complaint that same afternoon. The county representative promised to open an investigation. For the first time since the bulldozer roared through my land, I felt a flicker of control returning. But it didn't last long. 2 days later, a new envelope appeared in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo. Inside was a notice of violation, citing me for unsightly debris and unapproved exterior conditions. They were fining me $250 a day for the rubble Greg's own crew had created. I laughed bitterly at the irony. They destroy my barn, then fine me for the mess they made. The power struggle between me and Greg wasn't just about a barn anymore. It was about control, his need to dominate, my refusal to bow. The HOA wasn't protecting the community, it was protecting his ego. As the sun set behind the wreckage, the shadows stretched long across the dirt, like scars that wouldn't fade. I stood there in the silence, vowing that Greg Simmons would answer for every nail he stole from my father's memory. But when I went inside that night, there was another envelope waiting on my front door, taped at eye level, bold black ink staring back at me. Foreclosure notice. And at the bottom, written in Greg's precise, smug handwriting, was his signature. I stared in the mirror and said it out loud. If he wants a fight, he's got one. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the same woman who'd sobbed in the dirt days earlier. My eyes were red, but not from crying anymore. They burned. There was fire in them. Somewhere between the wreckage of my father's barn and that foreclosure notice. Something inside me hardened. Greg Simmons wanted me scared and silent. He was about to get the exact opposite. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by coffee cups, open folders, and the thick HOA handbook I'd never bothered to read cover to cover. Each page was a battlefield of legal jargon and fine print. The same weapon Greg used to bully every homeowner in the subdivision. If he could twist the rules to destroy my barn, I could use them to destroy his peace. I thought back to my father, to the nights he'd stand by the barn gate, hands on his hips, watching the sun set after long days of work. Whenever life hit hard, when we lost crops to storms, or bills piled up, he'd always say the same thing. When they corner you, ride harder. I could almost hear his voice in my head that night, calm but firm. "All right, Dad," I whispered to the quiet house. "Let's ride." Hour after hour, I studied those bylaws. Most of it was the usual HOA nonsense: paint colors, mailbox heights, lawn maintenance. But then, buried deep under Section 9, subsection C, a single phrase caught my eye. All members of the association shall have equal access to common recreational spaces, including but not limited to the clubhouse lawn. I read it twice, then 3 times. It was like finding gold in the dirt. That lawn, Greg's pristine, perfectly trimmed HOA proud showcase, belonged to every homeowner, not just him and his board. That meant I had the same right to use it as anyone else. And suddenly a wild, rebellious thought began to form. If Greg wanted to erase my family's legacy, I'd build it back where he least expected it, on his precious clubhouse lawn. And I wouldn't just rebuild the barn, I'd bring it back, to life in spirit. A rodeo, the same kind my father used to host every summer. Loud, proud, messy, and unapologetically Texan. The plan made me laugh out loud, half from disbelief, half from sheer adrenaline. I opened my old contacts list and started dialing numbers I hadn't called in years. "Jake," I said when he picked up, "how fast can you get your trailer here?" He laughed. "Depends. You finally running from the HOA?" "Not running," I said. "Riding straight through it." Next, I called Tessa, my childhood friend and fellow barrel racer. She didn't even let me finish before saying, "I'm in. Just tell me when." By midnight, my kitchen table looked less like a desk and more like a war room. Maps of the clubhouse property, supply lists, names of volunteers, all scribbled across sheets of paper. My heart pounded with something I hadn't felt in weeks. Purpose. Greg Simmons had used rules to tear me down. I was going to use those same rules to raise something bigger. Something louder. Something that would make the entire neighborhood see who the real outlaw was. And it wasn't me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the mess of papers and plans. For the first time since the bulldozer crushed my barn, I smiled. I didn't just plan to rebuild, I planned to humiliate him on his own turf. At sunrise, I yelled, "Bring the trucks! Bring the panels!" and watched Greg's face twist from confusion to rage. The rumble of diesel engines echoed down the street as Jake's pickup rolled in first, hauling metal fencing stacked high in the bed. Behind him came Tessa, towing a trailer full of bleachers, hay bales, and barrels. The HOA's perfectly trimmed clubhouse lawn, Greg's pride and joy, was about to become a rodeo arena. The grass sparkled with dew, neat rows of sprinklers still ticking from their morning cycle. By the time we started unloading, half the neighborhood was awake, standing on porches, whispering behind coffee mugs. You could almost taste the curiosity in the air. Some looked scandalized. Others smiled. Finally, someone was doing what they'd always wanted to, but never dared. I could feel Greg's eyes on us before I even saw him. His voice sliced through the air from across the parking lot. "What the hell is this?" I turned, hands shielding my eyes from the sun. "Community recreation," I said simply, nodding toward the growing arena. He marched toward me, his dress shoes sinking into the wet grass. "You can't do this," he shouted. "This is private HOA property." I pulled a folded paper from my back pocket, the same one I'd highlighted the night before. "Actually," I said, unfolding it slowly, "according to Section 9C of the bylaws, all members are entitled to equal use of recreational spaces. You know, common areas." He reached for it, but I held it just out of reach. "Don't worry, Greg. I made extra copies." Jake chuckled under his breath, hammering a post into the ground. The clang echoed through the air, deliberate, defiant. Tessa shouted from across the lot, "Where do you want the bleachers, boss?" "Right there," I answered, pointing to the center of Greg's perfect green square. The sound of the post driver rang like gunfire through the calm morning. By noon, the setup looked like a festival. Bleachers aligned, barrels spaced out, ropes coiled neatly near the starting chute. Horses whinnied in trailers, restless and ready. Dust from the equipment trucks mixed with the smell of hay and leather. The HOA clubhouse, usually silent and sterile, had never felt more alive. Greg was pacing now, phone to his ear. I heard snippets. Violation, unauthorized, police. A few minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly up the street. I crossed my arms, waiting as Sheriff Moore stepped out. "Afternoon, Sheriff," I said. "Beautiful day for a community event," Greg pounced. "She's trespassing. This is HOA land." Sheriff Moore adjusted his sunglasses and looked at the bylaws I handed him. He read quietly for a long moment, then looked at Greg. "Says here all members can use the property for recreation. Looks to me like she's got every right." Greg's jaw tightened. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm dead serious," Moore replied. "Now, unless there's a noise complaint, I suggest you let folks enjoy their weekend." Greg's face flushed red as the sheriff tipped his hat and headed back to his cruiser. Around us, neighbors clapped softly, pretending to cough to hide their grins. Greg spun toward me, his composure cracking. "This isn't over," he hissed. I met his glare, calm and steady. "Didn't think it was." As the sheriff drove off, Greg muttered, barely loud enough to hear, "Enjoy this while you can, Whitfield." I smiled, wiping the sweat from my brow as Jake handed me a wrench. "Oh, I intend to." When I shouted, "Light the arena," and heard the first cheer, it felt like my barn had come back to life. The floodlights flickered on, cutting through the dusk and bathing the newly built arena in golden beams. Dust rose like smoke under the lamps, and the smell of hay and barbecue filled the air. Country music thumped from a set of speakers borrowed from the local high school, and for the first time in weeks, the neighborhood didn't feel cold and hostile. It felt alive. Families poured in through the temporary gates, kids dragging their parents toward the bleachers. The HOA clubhouse lawn, once a pristine symbol of Greg Simmons' control, was now alive with laughter, chatter, and the clatter of boots on metal stands. Jake waved from the chute, tipping his hat as he prepped the first bull. Tessa adjusted the barrels, a smile stretching across her face like she'd been waiting her whole life for this kind of rebellion. I'd printed flyers that said Community Rodeo Night, $5 a maintenance fee. People paid happily, tossing bills into the old coffee can we used as a cash box. The sound of coins and laughter mixed with the ring of cowbells and horse hooves. It wasn't just a rodeo. It was a declaration of freedom. I stood near the fence, taking it all in. The cheers, the lights, the kids running barefoot in the grass. Every sound hit me in the chest. My father used to say a rodeo wasn't just about the ride, it was about spirit. As long as the dust keeps rising, he'd say, "You're still fighting." Tonight, I finally understood what he meant. The barn may have been gone, but the spirit of what he built was alive in every heartbeat, every hoofbeat, every cheer. Then I saw him. Greg Simmons stood at the far edge of the lawn, arms crossed, holding his phone out like a weapon. He wasn't there to enjoy the show. He was there to document it, to find something, anything he could twist into a violation. His face was tight with anger, the kind of expression that said this wasn't over. He was filming the crowd, the ticket line, even the donation jar. I caught his eye for a split second. He smirked. I smiled wider. Let him film. Every second of this was legal. Every rule he'd written now turned against him. The bylaws were my armor, and the community was my shield. A few neighbors whispered near the bleachers, stealing glances toward Greg. One of them, an older man I barely knew, leaned toward me and said, "You've got guts, Miss Whitfield. Nobody's ever stood up to that man before." I nodded, eyes still fixed on the arena. Well, someone had to. The night went on in a blur of lights and motion. Horses thundered around barrels. Bulls kicked against chutes. The crowd clapped in rhythm with the music. And as I watched Jake's bull twist under the lights, I felt it. My father's presence. It wasn't imagination. It was pride. It was memory. It was legacy refusing to die. When the final rider dismounted and the crowd gave a standing ovation, I looked up at the stars. For the first time since the demolition, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I'd reclaimed. The laughter carried on late into the night. But as the last car pulled away and the lights dimmed, I saw a shadow near the clubhouse door. Greg, watching, phone still in his hand. His silhouette didn't move until the final light went out. The next morning, I was sipping coffee when a courier truck stopped in front of my driveway. The man stepped out, envelope in hand. "Delivery for Sarah Whitfield," he said. I tore it open and froze. Restraining order, filed by Greg Simmons. Standing before the judge, I slammed the HOA document on the table. "Your Honor, this is my land they destroyed." My voice echoed through the small county courtroom, cutting through the murmurs and shuffling papers. My palms were sweaty, my heart racing, but I refused to let my voice shake. Across the aisle, Greg Simmons sat with his arms crossed, a smug little smile resting on his face. He looked like a man confident the system would protect him. After all, it always had. Greg's lawyer, a slick-looking man in a gray suit, stood with a rehearsed sigh. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "my client represents a respected homeowners association. Ms. Whitfield's property, while certainly sentimental to her, violated several architectural and community standards. Her subsequent actions have disrupted the peace and violated multiple community rules. Disrupted the peace? I snapped before I could stop myself. He sent a bulldozer onto my property without a permit. The judge, a tired woman in her 50s with half-moon glasses, lifted a hand. Ms. Whitfield, please let counsel finish. Greg's lawyer continued, pretending to sound sympathetic. Furthermore, her so-called rodeo events have created a public nuisance. Loud noises, crowds, and commercial activity on HOA property, completely outside the scope of community use. I couldn't hold back anymore. Nuisance? I said, stepping forward. You want to talk about nuisance? He destroyed my barn, threatened me with foreclosure, and now he's pretending to be the victim. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you have evidence of the alleged demolition? Do I muttered, pulling out a thick folder from my bag. I laid out photographs of the demolition, a printed copy of the county's response confirming no permit was filed, and highlighted sections of the HOA bylaws, specifically the clause about equal access to recreational areas. Here, I said, flipping to the page I'd practically memorized. Section 9C. All members shall have equal rights to use community recreation areas unless explicitly amended by a full membership vote. There's been no such amendment, Your Honor. Not once. The judge leaned forward, scanning the paper. Greg's lawyer tried to object, but she waved him off. Mr. Simmons, she said, turning to Greg, is this accurate? Greg shifted in his seat. Well, technically, but technically, the judge interrupted. The law doesn't operate on technically. You can't bulldoze private property without a court order, and you can't restrict shared property without a membership vote. Greg's smirk faltered. For the first time since the demolition, I saw it, the crack in his confidence. He looked at his lawyer, silently demanding help, but the man just shrugged slightly, knowing the argument was lost. The judge tapped her pen on the desk. Until this board holds a proper member vote, Ms. Whitfield's use of the property is within her rights. The restraining order is dismissed. A collective gasp ran through the room. I closed my eyes for half a second, feeling a rush of relief flood my chest. I'd done it. For once the law had stood where it was supposed to. As the gavel struck wood, I gathered my papers, refusing to look at Greg. I could feel his glare burning holes into the back of my head as I walked past him toward the doors. But just as I stepped into the hallway, I heard his voice behind me. Low, bitter, and laced with venom. If the law won't stop you, he whispered, I will. I turned just enough to meet his eyes, steady and unflinching. Then you better bring more than paperwork this time, Greg. The crowd screamed. The lights went out. The horses panicked, and I smelled burning wires. One moment the arena was alive with music and laughter, and the next, everything vanished into blackness. The sound of hooves pounding against the dirt echoed like thunder. I heard a child crying somewhere near the bleachers, followed by the frantic voices of parents trying to calm their kids. Dust rose into the air, choking and thick, as people stumbled in the dark. Kill the power! Jake shouted from somewhere behind the chutes. Someone cut the damn lights. My heart was racing so hard I could barely hear. The air felt electric, charged with confusion and fear. I grabbed my flashlight from the announcer's booth and sprinted toward the back of the clubhouse where the power boxes were mounted. The beam of light danced across the wet grass and landed on the metal casing. The panel door was wide open. When I got closer, the smell hit me. Sharp, metallic, unmistakably burnt. Wires dangled loose, some still sparking faintly. A trail of muddy footprints led up to the box, then veered off into the dark. Someone had deliberately sabotaged it, and judging by the soaked insulation, they'd poured water on the wiring to make sure it shorted completely. Tessa ran up behind me, out of breath. Sarah, the horses are spooked bad, she said. Jake's trying to calm them down, but this could have gone real bad. I clenched my jaw. It wasn't an accident, I said. Someone did this on purpose. Someone, she said carefully, or Greg. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew. By the time the police arrived, the crowd had mostly dispersed. Parents carried sleeping kids to cars, volunteers loaded the last of the equipment. The once lively arena now looked like a war zone. Dark, muddy, and silent except for the faint hum of generators the officers brought in to give us light. An officer with a notepad asked me to explain everything. I walked him through the timeline. Lights went out. Crowd panicked, discovered damage. He crouched beside the electrical box and shined his flashlight over the wires. "Looks deliberate," he said. "Who do you think might have done this?" I hesitated. "Greg Simmons," I said quietly. "HOA president. He's been trying to shut me down since this started." The officer nodded, jotting the name down. "We'll check his whereabouts, ma'am, but without a witness or video, it's just speculation." Speculation. That word sat like a stone in my chest. Greg was smart, too smart to get caught by word alone. As the patrol cars pulled away, the silence felt heavier than the night itself. I walked through the empty arena, boots sinking into soft mud where hooves had trampled. The lights, the laughter, the energy, it was all gone. In its place was fear. Not just mine, but everyone's. I could feel it settling over the neighborhood like a fog. I sat on the arena fence, staring at Onsantichi, the clubhouse lawn that had once been Greg's trophy and was now my battlefield. For the first time since this all began, doubt crept in. What if he was willing to go further? What if next time, someone really got hurt? But fear doesn't last long when you've already lost everything once. It just changes shape. It becomes something sharper, something that burns hotter. The next morning, I went out early and installed 3 motion-activated security cameras around the clubhouse and 2 more on my own property. Jake helped me set them up, saying nothing but giving me a look that said he knew exactly why I was doing it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind against the windows made my stomach twist. I woke up before sunrise and checked the camera feeds on my laptop, not expecting to find anything. But at 2:13 a.m., there he was, Greg Simmons, moving behind the clubhouse, flashlight in hand, head down, walking straight toward the power box. I hit upload and said, "Let's see how Greg likes being the headline." My hands trembled as the progress bar filled on the screen. The video I'd spent the night editing was short but damning. Greg Simmons, the almighty HOA president, caught on camera sneaking behind the clubhouse with a flashlight in the middle of the night. The image wasn't grainy or vague. It was crystal clear. His face, his posture, even the HOA badge on his polo shirt. All of it, right there in 1080p. Within an hour, the video started picking up steam. A few shares turned into dozens, dozens into hundreds. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications flooded the screen. Comments, reposts, friend requests, messages from strangers. The caption I'd written was simple. Caught on camera. HOA president sabotages community event. It spread like wildfire. People were furious, not just in my town, but across the country. Classic HOA abuse. One comment read, "Good for you, Sarah. Fight back," said another. My little rodeo rebellion had turned into a public movement overnight. By the second day, local news stations were calling. Channel 5 wanted an interview, then Channel 8. Even a Dallas reporter left a message asking if they could feature the story for their weekend segment. I barely had time to breathe. My inbox was overflowing. The rodeo that started as my way to honor my father was now front-page news, a symbol of standing up to power-hungry HOAs everywhere. Meanwhile, Greg Simmons vanished. His car wasn't in the driveway. His porch lights stayed off. Rumor was he'd taken a short leave from HOA duties. But even hiding, he still tried to fight. On the 3rd day, I got a letter from a law firm in town claiming defamation and demanding I take the video down immediately. I read it twice, then laughed. Defamation? The footage was proof. If Greg wanted to threaten me with legal jargon, he'd have to do it in front of every camera in Texas, because I wasn't deleting a single second. The best part? Support started pouring in from everywhere. Neighbors who had never dared speak against Greg dropped by my house to offer donations, snacks, and help. One woman, Mrs. Turner, handed me a check for $1,000. My husband wanted to build a shed last year, she said. Greg shut him down. This is for your rebuild. I started a small online fundraiser, mostly just to keep track of the community donations. By the next morning, it had crossed $20,000, then 30. My jaw dropped when I saw a comment from someone in Arizona who wrote, "We don't even live in your state, but we've dealt with HOAs like yours. Don't stop fighting." The money wasn't just for a barn anymore. It was fuel for something bigger. A message that people everywhere were tired of being bullied in their own homes. And for the first time, I noticed a shift in tone from inside the HOA itself. Whispers of meetings, emails being forwarded around, members questioning Greg's leadership. One of the board members, a woman named Linda who had always kept her distance, stopped by my fence line one afternoon. "Off the record," she said quietly, glancing around. "There's talk of removing Greg. People are angry, real angry." It hit me then, the power of truth. The camera didn't just catch Greg in the act. It caught his entire empire of intimidation crumbling. That evening, as the sunset painted the sky orange over the wreckage of my old barn, my laptop chimed with a new email. The subject line was short and official. HOA Board, Emergency Meeting, Discussion of Disciplinary Action. I walked into the clubhouse with a cowboy hat and a USB drive full of truth. The air inside was thick, the kind of silence that hangs before a storm. Every seat was taken. HOA members sat at the front table in their usual line of authority, but their faces were pale and tense. The back of the room was packed with neighbors, local reporters, and a few folks who'd just come to watch the fireworks. The moment I stepped through those double doors, all eyes turned to me. Greg Simmons sat dead center at the table, flanked by two board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. His tie was crooked, his jaw tight. The man who once carried himself like a small-town king now looked like someone standing trial. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for joining us. Tonight's meeting is about community unity, though I'll admit, your recent actions have made that difficult." Community unity. The words tasted like poison. I took a seat near the front and set my laptop on the table. The reporters were already taking notes. Greg adjusted his microphone, pretending to stay calm. "As most of you know," he continued, "Ms. Whitfield's rodeo events have caused, well, let's call them disturbances, noise, complaints, property damage, and frankly, embarrassment to our community's image. We've been made into a spectacle." "Embarrassment?" I said, standing up. My voice was steady, calm. "No, Greg. The embarrassment isn't my rodeo. It's your behavior." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Greg's fake smile faltered. "Excuse me." "You heard me," I said. "You've spent months terrorizing homeowners under the guise of community standards. You demolished my barn without a permit. You fined me for the mess you made. And when that didn't shut me up, you sabotaged our power mid-event. You endangered people, children, just to make a point." Gasps filled the room. Greg raised a hand, voice shaking. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Whitfield, and I won't stand here while you—" I clicked the laptop and turned the projector toward the screen behind him. "You won't have to stand for long," I said. "Let's let the footage talk." The room dimmed as the video began to play. There was Greg, moving through the dark, flashlight in hand, walking straight toward the electrical box. Every face in that room turned toward him, wide-eyed, silent. The audio caught the click of the panel opening, the spark of a wire, then the video froze on Greg's face as he turned toward the camera. Gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into shouts. "Is that him? Sure looks like it. Unbelievable." Greg shot to his feet. "This is doctored," he yelled. "This is a fake video. She's manipulating everyone." I crossed my arms. "That's your defense? That your own HOA shirt, your own flashlight, your own car in the background are all fake too?" Someone from the back shouted. "You've gone too far, Greg. and the room erupted. The reporters scribbled frantically. Cameras flashed. Greg turned red, shouting over the noise, "This is harassment, you can't do this to me." But his voice was drowned out by the crowd. People he'd fined for trivial things, unapproved garden fences, overgrown lawns, flags that weren't regulation size, were finally speaking up. "Maybe now you'll know what it's like to be bullied," one woman shouted. "You fined me $500 for a bird bath," another yelled. The room was chaos, years of resentment bursting free all at once. The board's vice president, Linda, banged a small gavel against the table. "Order," she shouted. "This is an official meeting." The crowd simmered down, though anger still buzzed in the air. Linda looked from Greg to me, then at the screen still showing his frozen face. "This is unacceptable," she said quietly. "If this video is real, Mr. Simmons has violated both HOA policy and state law." Greg tried to speak, but Linda turned to the members. "I move to remove Mr. Simmons from his position as president, effective immediately. All in favor?" Hands shot up. Nearly everyone in the room. Greg spun around, staring in disbelief as even his allies avoided his eyes. "You can't," he began, but the gavel struck again. "It's done," Linda said firmly. "Greg Simmons is hereby removed as president of the Willow Creek HOA." Applause broke out. Not polite, but wild and cathartic. Years of frustration and fear, released in a single roar of victory. I didn't join in. I just watched Greg's face the moment his empire finally cracked and crumbled. He turned toward me, his voice low and venomous. "You think this is over?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The room spoke for me. Just as I turned to leave, the clubhouse doors creaked open. The chatter quieted instantly. A man in a tan jacket and county badge stepped in, holding a thick file under his arm. His voice was calm, but his words sliced through the room like a whip. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "I'm looking for a Mr. Greg Simmons." Greg froze. "That's me." The man nodded and held up a folder. "County Inspector's Office. We just concluded an investigation into a certain property demolition." He opened the folder, tapping the top page. "And it seems we've got a demolition order here. One with your forged signature on it." The inspector said it clear as day. "Mr. Simmons, you illegally ordered a demolition." The room went dead silent. Greg's mouth opened like he was going to argue, but no sound came out. The inspector dropped the manila folder on the table, and the papers fanned out like evidence at a crime scene. The top page bore Greg's unmistakable signature, the same looping G and arrogant flourish on the S. Greg stammered, "That's not mine. I didn't—" The inspector cut him off. "We've already confirmed it with the county clerk's office. The original records show no permit, no approval, and no inspection logs. The demolition company you hired submitted an invoice directly to the HOA, listing your name as authorizing party." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the reporters stopped writing for a moment. Greg looked around, desperate for someone to speak up for him, but no one did. Not even Linda, who sat stiffly with her hands clasped in front of her like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. The inspector continued, voice steady but sharp. "That means, Mr. Simmons, that you not only falsified HOA documentation, but also violated county property laws. You ordered the destruction of private property without due process. The fines alone will exceed $50,000, and that's before civil damages." Greg's face drained of color. His lawyer, who'd been silent through most of the chaos, leaned in and whispered something that made him sag even more. I stood there, arms crossed, watching him unravel. For weeks I'd imagined what justice might look like. Greg being forced to admit what he'd done, being stripped of his title, being exposed for what he really was. But seeing it actually happen didn't feel like triumph. It felt heavy. All the anger, all the pain. It finally had somewhere to go, and what was left behind was exhaustion. The inspector turned to me next. "Ms. Whitfield, the county is formally acknowledging your complaint. You are entitled to seek damages through civil court. We recommend you retain counsel for this." though I suspect you won't have trouble winning." Greg snapped up from his seat, slamming his palms on the table. "This is ridiculous. She's lying. That barn was an eyesore. I did this community a favor." The inspector didn't flinch. "A favor that's going to cost you a lot more than a fresh coat of paint, Mr. Simmons." As he spoke, I noticed something shift in the faces around us. Fear, the kind that Greg had ruled this community with, was gone. Neighbors were whispering now, not about me, but about him. For the first time, he was the outsider. The enforcer had become the condemned. Over the following weeks, the fallout was brutal for him. County fines, a pending criminal investigation, and a class action suit from several HOA members who'd had their own issues buried under Greg's rule. The local news covered every development, and each new headline was another nail in the coffin of his reputation. HOA president under investigation for fraudulent demolition. Willow Creek, HOA faces state audit. It wasn't just Greg who fell. The entire HOA board dissolved under state review. With evidence of falsified records and misused funds, the state suspended its operations indefinitely. For the first time in years, the people of Willow Creek could breathe without worrying about what letter might appear in their mailbox next. As for me, the county restored my property rights in full. Every fine Greg had issued was voided, every violation dismissed. The land where my barn once stood was finally, legally, and publicly mine again. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact stopped by to shake my hand. Some even cried, saying they'd been too scared to stand up before. I didn't blame them. Greg's kind of power doesn't just come from paperwork. It comes from fear, and fear had ruled long enough. I met with an attorney about the damages, and she smiled after reading the file. "You've got an airtight case, Sarah. HOAs aren't untouchable, and in your case, they're about to learn that the hard way." Legal nugget. Homeowners can claim full damages, including emotional distress, when an HOA acts outside its legal authority. In my case, that meant not only rebuilding, but being compensated for every nail they stole, and every night they kept me up in fear. Weeks later, I sat in the same courthouse where Greg once sneered at me. Only this time, he wasn't sitting across the aisle. He was sitting in the defendant's chair. When the judge ruled in my favor, I didn't even smile. I just closed my eyes and exhaled. As I walked out of court victorious, sunlight spilling across the steps, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down at the caller ID. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't the county. It was a number from Los Angeles. When I answered, a cheerful voice said, "Hi, Sarah. I'm calling from a national news network. We'd love to feature your story." I stood in the dirt where my barn once stood and said, "Let's build it back. Bigger, stronger, louder." The land was quiet again, but it didn't feel like loss this time. It felt like promise. The county's investigation had closed, Greg was gone, and for the first time in months, I could stand on my property without fear. The ashes that once symbolized defeat now felt like the foundation of something new. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Strangers who'd followed my story online sent donations with messages that made me tear up. One note said, "You fought for all of us who were too scared to speak." Another simply read, "For your father's legacy, build it proud." In just a few weeks, the rebuild fund passed $40,000. Local hardware stores offered supplies at cost, and a construction crew from 2 towns over volunteered labor on weekends. On the first day of the construction, I placed my father's old hammer on a post as a good luck charm. Jake showed up before sunrise with coffee, and Tessa brought her brothers, who went straight to work setting fence lines. Even neighbors who had once avoided eye contact were now bringing food, lending tools, and rolling up their sleeves. It wasn't just a barn anymore. It was a community project, a shared rebellion that everyone wanted to see finished. By the end of the first month, the structure started to rise, a massive red and white building that gleamed in the sun like a symbol of everything Greg tried to destroy. I named it Whitfield Arena in honor of my father, painting the words across the front in bold white letters. The first time I stepped inside, the scent of new wood hit me. Clean, warm and alive. I ran my hand across a smooth beam, remembering the rough boards of the old barn, and whispered, "We did it, Dad." When construction wrapped, the town came together again. This time not for protest or anger, but for celebration. We held a ribbon-cutting ceremony right at sunset. Kids ran around in cowboy hats 2 sizes too big, and the sound of laughter rolled across the open field. I'd never seen the neighborhood so alive. That's when the idea came, to turn this new beginning into something that gave back. My father had been a veteran, and I knew what the rodeo had meant to him. So I made a decision. Every year, Whitfield Arena would host a charity rodeo supporting veterans and local children's hospitals. The first event would be free for the community, a symbol that no matter how much they tried to silence me, the spirit of this land couldn't be contained behind any HOA rulebook. Word spread fast. Sponsors reached out, local bands volunteered to play, and by the time we opened the ticket line, it felt like the entire county was behind it. Reporters called again, asking to cover the comeback story of the year. I didn't care about fame. I cared about seeing families together, hearing laughter, and knowing I'd rebuilt more than a barn. I'd rebuilt hope. As I walked the freshly painted arena grounds the night before opening, I could almost hear my father's voice again. "Told you, firecracker," he'd say. "They can't fence in a Whitfield." On the opening night, the crowd filled every seat. The arena lights glowed like a crown against the dark sky, and the sound of country music carried on the wind. I stood near the announcer's booth, heart full, eyes wet, watching families clap and cheer as the riders took their marks. For the first time in what felt like forever, peace settled over me. Not quiet peace, but the kind that hums with pride. And then, as I turned toward the outer fence, I saw him, Greg Simmons, standing alone, hands in his pockets, a ticket in his hand. Greg walked up slow and said, "You won, Sarah." I smiled, steady and calm. "No, Greg, justice won." His voice was quiet, almost buried under the sound of the crowd. The stands behind us were full, the music loud, the dust swirling in the glow of the arena lights. The Whitfield Arena was alive, full of energy, laughter, and the thunder of hooves. Everything he had tried to destroy now stood taller, louder, and prouder than ever. He looked different, smaller somehow. No suit, no arrogance, no crowd of board members standing behind him. Just a man who had finally realized he wasn't untouchable. For a long moment we stood there in the noise, the ghosts of our battle hanging heavy between us. "I shouldn't have done it," he said finally, eyes down. "The demolition, the fines, all of it. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was just protecting control. I went too far." For weeks, I'd imagined this moment, the apology, the admission. I thought it would feel satisfying. But standing there, with the crowd cheering in the background and the smell of hay and barbecue in the air, it just felt peaceful. The war was over. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it. "But this land? It's mine. It's my family's, and it'll stay that way. You ever come near it again for the wrong reasons, I won't fight you in meetings or paperwork. I'll fight you in court, and this time, you already know who wins." He nodded slowly, eyes wet, shame etched deep across his face. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, blending into the dust and the noise of the crowd. That was the last time I ever saw Greg Simmons. When I turned back to the arena, the final event of the night was about to begin. The bleachers shook with excitement as the announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first annual Whitfield Charity Rodeo." The lights dimmed, and for a heartbeat, the world went quiet. Then, fireworks erupted overhead, streaking the night sky in red, white, and blue. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. Children screamed with joy, and parents clapped in rhythm with the music. I stood near the fence, the dust from the arena rising around me, and felt my father's presence again, proud, steady, and strong. The announcer's voice boomed. "This event is dedicated to every family who's ever stood their ground. every veteran who's ever fought for home, and every person who refuses to be bullied by power. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. That was my story, our story. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. When the fireworks faded and the crowd began to leave, I turned toward the camera crew filming for the TV segment and smiled. If you're watching this, I said, remember, stand your ground, learn your rights, fight back the right way, because they can take your walls, they can take your comfort, but they can't take your spirit unless you hand it to them. The reporter nodded, the camera still rolling. The dust swirled around my boots, glowing in the last flicker of fireworks above the arena. I looked straight into the lens, voice firm and clear. What would you do if your HOA bulldozed your home? Tell me below, because I didn't just rebuild. I rode back stronger. Then I tipped my hat to the crowd and added, and if you believe in standing up to corruption, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe. Because the fight for home isn't over. It's just getting started.